Hey there, my name is John Negroni. I am the film editor for theyoungfolks.com. I also host the Cinemaholics podcast, so definitely check that out if you want to hear my thoughts on other movies in even more detail and all that good stuff. So X is a new horror slasher A24 film from director Ty West. I've previously been aware of Ty West as an actor, actually, in a few Joe Swanberg films, particularly Drinking Buddies, an old favorite of mine. But this is actually the first time I have honed in on one of Ty West's directorial features. Now, he's been making films since 2005. A lot of them have been indie, kind of micro-budget films. And that said, I mean, X is far from his first horror film from what I can tell, but it's certainly his most noticeable, one of those words. It's certainly his most notable release yet, despite it having a pretty low budget and unassuming presentation. This thing is coming out theatrically sort of in the wake of the Batman. We're still sort of reeling from the Batman kind of taking the box office by storm, and this is releasing alongside a few other releases that I think are kind of taking up space, but aren't necessarily like built to be blockbusters. However, I could see X doing pretty well financially. And on that note too, I want to say I apologize for this review coming so late. I was supposed to see X earlier this week. I've been covering South by Southwest, but not really reviewing films or editing reviews of films, and I haven't seen a lot of things. And I also missed my screening for X2, all kinds of excuses. So I apologize for that. I'm coming super late, but I did manage to catch X finally, and I'm glad I did. Now, this film centers around a film crew in the 1970s. That's right, we have a 70s film on our hands. And this film crew, we quickly learn, are making a pornography feature in Texas, but they're trying to find the right location. Their executive producer is played by Martin Henderson, and he arranges for them to stay at what is basically like an auxiliary farmhouse. It's near Houston, Texas, where they're also going to not just stay there, but film the majority of the sex scenes in their stag feature. Now, along for the ride, pun not intended, we have Brittany Snow as the lead actress in the stag film, not the movie, this movie X. We also have Kid Cudi as the leading man in the stag film, which I was like, Kid Cudi, that's awesome. Glad to see him in another acting role. I don't remember the last time I saw him acting. We have Owen Campbell as the director of the film. He kind of wants to believe that he's making a French New Wave film. He thinks he's Francois Truffaut, so that character kind of writes himself, honestly. And then we have Jenna Ortega, who is his girlfriend, but also the boom mic operator. And finally, Mia Goth as the executive producer's girlfriend, and she's the other actor in the film whom he says has this mysterious X factor, which, by the way, Mia Goth, loved her in Mayday and Emma, which, Emma was like one of the last films I remember seeing pre-COVID, so whenever I see Mia Goth, I like immediately go to that Jane Austen adaptation. But anyway, right off the bat in this movie, something seems incredibly wrong with the farmhouse where they're staying, because just across the lawn, there's actually this like main house. Like, so I said before, they're in an auxiliary house. It's sort of like this extra part of the property, but there's a main house where an elderly couple are staying, and they're totally unaware that the people that they've said can stay here are making a pornography film. And they're making a porn film in their backyard. And as the film progresses, you can probably see where this movie is going, but of course I will not give much away from there. Now, the first half hour or so of X made quite an impression on me, to the point where I was wondering, is this going to be one of my favorite films of 2022, at least like early favorite films? I was really digging this. It's shot so lovingly as an early 70s auteur film that just happens to be an early 70s slasher film too. It's kind of both. And those atmospheric elements that you would expect from both of those different kinds of things, they actually come together really effectively when X is in its slow burn mode. Now, I got to say, this is nothing like Netflix's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't know if a lot of people on this channel who follow me actually even saw that, but there was a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. It came out on Netflix like a month ago, a few weeks ago. I don't even remember because time is ridiculous, but it came out pretty recently, and That was also a Texas-based horror film that followed a group of youngish yuppies kind of in over their heads. It was directly homaging 70s horror, but it took place in like the modern day. And it was kind of just doing the Halloween 2018 thing. But what's interesting about this movie, where X stands apart, is that for a good chunk of its runtime, it actually has way more in common with Wanda than it does something like The Last House on the Left or The Hills Have Eyes, things along those lines. Where the movie let me down, though, was when it shifted gears like a little too suddenly into being just those slasher films. Like it kind of goes in a direction where I wanted it to be more. It's odd because like we know that the film is going to transition from being this kind of like subversive, heightened, creepy drama into being a slasher. Like we know it's coming. It's promised from the first scene, but the film does set you up to think that it's also going to be a subversive heightened slasher in the same way as a subversive heightened drama, but it's not. It's a standard slasher, which is fine because standard slashers they're fun like when done well, and X is done well, but I couldn't help but wonder what we might be missing out on because the first half is so avant-garde. It made me yearn for a second half that is also pushing boundaries and is more surprising. And, that's not to say that X isn't dark or anything. It is very dark. A lot of ridiculous things happen in this movie. This is not a film that could have come out in the 1970s, even though it is shot that way. Like, if it wasn't for certain scenes in this movie, I could be like, you could have made this in the 70s. Like, I could believe that Ty West, had only ever seen movies from the 60s and the 70s and it was like, I'm going to make a movie now, and then he made this. Like I could see that, right? Except for where we have, and in a good way, some of these horrific set pieces, some truly terrifying moments and imagery that reek of the modern day, like how in 2022, you can have more permissive boundaries in terms of like what you can get away with when it comes to theatrical wide releases. That said, the film is kind of limited by its own ideas through the horror, through the slasher elements. It's presenting concepts and emotional through lines that are inherently fascinating, but they don't ultimately come together for a satisfying final act. It's more like a smattering of themes that are just sort of there to be there, if that makes sense. For example, one of the main thrusts of the film is that the elderly woman is frustrated because she wants a more fulfilling sex life from her partner, but he's afraid to be more intimate because of his health. Now, that is a great entry point for a horror film to explore the anxieties of getting older and being envious of the younger generations and maybe resenting them for supposedly flaunting the excesses of their physical expression. I mean, it is the 1970s, right? But when it comes time for the film to deliver on that theme through its horror, it mostly just goes down the expected paths. I mean, not fully, because there is one particular scene that is, it is skin crawling when it comes to just, I can't even describe it without like feeling it again, but it only involves one character. And I do think the rest of the actors here kind of get pushed to the side on that note, particularly Jenna Ortega, who was terrific in Scream earlier this year. She has such star quality, not just in horror, but in indie dramas like The Fallout. But in this film, she's sort of relegated to being the simplistically silent, innocent girl, though the film does wisely kind of lean heavily toward Mia Goth. She's the real star of this movie. She plays the most fascinating character, and she's absolutely arresting as this young woman who defies, in a lot of ways, the final girl trope. And I really appreciated the movie in that sense, for sure. I do recommend X to anyone who considers themselves a fan of horror or 70s films in general. Even better if you love 70s horror. Like if you love the 70s and horror and the 70s horror, I mean, this is it. Like, check this out. Like you're probably going to really like this, but just make sure that you go in with the expectation that the more introspective elements of the first half don't exactly translate or transition into the vastly more straightforward shock slasher horror stuff that you get in the second half of the film. If you're game for both as you walk in, I have a feeling that X might mark the spot. I'm sorry, I had to say it. It's terrible. Not the movie, what I just said. Sorry. But yeah, X, it opens in theaters March 18th. Give it a shot. I think that in terms of original movies, it's not super original when it comes to how slavish it is to movies that have come before it. I do think that it is absolutely replicating those things in, like I said before, a loving way. I just get the sense that Wes is a big fan of that era and he's putting his own stamp on it. And it's a neat film in that respect. But yeah, it's just one that... There were just a couple things. Yeah, it just didn't quite hit the landing. And the main thing for me is that, yeah, I just don't think the themes go together super well. There was just a bit of a disconnect between the story that's going on with some characters versus the story that's coming on with like this character here and this character there and this character there. It's just like a lot of stuff just sort of mumbled together. And yeah, I was left a little wanting for this one, but not tremendously so. I had a good time while watching it. And if you decide to see X as well, hopefully you will enjoy it. That said, I am currently not reviewing a ton of films, at least not as many films as I usually do, especially in a film capacity. Like I'm still reviewing for Cinemaholics, but I basically went from watching and reviewing like 5 movies a week to like 1, which that is totally on purpose because I am like moving into like a big phase of my life where I, on a personal level, I'm like in the middle of like wedding planning, for example, which as you can imagine, as soon as I say that, it's like that should hopefully explain why I have been mostly absent from doing as many reviews as I used to do in the past. But hopefully things are going to get a little bit more easier from here. And not that I'm married yet, but that's happening pretty soon. All that said, I will be back hopefully to review a few more films next week and just... yeah, keep your eyes on this channel if you're interested in that sort of thing. Subscribe to the Cinemaholics podcast if, as I said before, you want to hear what I have to say along with my co-host, Will Ashton, about all the releases that we both checked out this past week. You can find Cinemaholics on all the podcast apps and things like that. But yeah, that's it from me on this one. I will see you guys on the next thing that I do.